The pen trembled in my hand as I stared at the resignation letter. Across the polished conference table, Vice President Thomas Vance sat with his arms crossed, watching me like a hawk watches wounded prey. His expression was calm, almost bored, as if forcing someone to resign was just another Thursday morning task. "Sign it, Vanessa," he said softly. "This is the cleanest way for everyone." The HR director, Patricia, wouldn't meet my eyes. She kept shuffling papers, her discomfort obvious in every small movement. I noticed my employee badge sitting on the table between us, already deactivated. The little red light that should have been green told me everything I needed to know. They'd planned this down to the smallest detail. "We both know you made a serious error in judgment," Thomas continued, leaning forward slightly. "Going outside the chain of command, making wild accusations without proof. The company can't tolerate that kind of behavior." My throat felt tight. Everything he was saying was a lie, and we both knew it. But in that moment, with Patricia's sympathetic but useless presence and Thomas's cold confidence, I realized something important. I was alone. The company I'd given 7 years of my life to had already erased me from their systems. I picked up the pen and signed my name, one careful letter at a time. As I wrote, I made myself a silent promise. "You win today, Thomas, but this isn't over." My name is Vanessa Moore, and until 3 hours ago, I was a senior financial analyst at Freightcore Logistics, one of Chicago's largest shipping and distribution companies. I'd spent 7 years building a career there, arriving early, staying late, doing everything the corporate handbook promised would lead to success. I wasn't flashy or political. I kept my head down and did excellent work. My performance reviews were always outstanding. My coworkers respected me. My managers praised my attention to detail and my ability to spot problems before they became disasters. That attention to detail was exactly what destroyed my career. Freightcore handled millions of dollars in transactions every month. Ships, trucks, warehouses, customs fees, vendor payments. The numbers were massive and complex, but they followed patterns. I'd spent years learning those patterns, understanding the rhythm of legitimate business expenses. So when something broke that rhythm, I noticed immediately. It started small, just a feeling that something was off, an invoice that didn't quite fit the usual profile, a vendor name I didn't recognize despite tracking every major supplier for 3 years. Most people would have ignored it, assumed someone else had approved it, moved on. I couldn't. Numbers don't lie, and these numbers were screaming. The first suspicious payment was for $42,000. It went to a company called Westfield Distribution Services, paid on March 15th. I pulled up our vendor database to check their contract details. The company didn't exist in our system. I sat back in my chair, frowning at my computer screen. That shouldn't be possible. Every vendor had to be registered, approved by procurement, added to the system with contact information, tax identification numbers, and service agreements. We had entire departments dedicated to vendor management. I searched again, trying different spellings. Nothing. Then I noticed another payment to the same company. $42,000. Exactly the same amount, paid on April 15th. My stomach tightened as I expanded my search parameters. May 15th, another $42,000. June 15th, same amount. July 15th, same amount. Someone was paying this mystery company $42,000 every single month, like clockwork. Over 6 months, that was over $250,000 flowing to a vendor that officially didn't exist. I printed the payment records and started digging deeper. The approval signatures on the invoices all came from the same person, Thomas Vance, Vice President of Operations. My hands went cold as I stared at his signature, repeated on document after document. I spent 3 days checking everything. I pulled records going back 2 years and found the payment started 18 months ago. Always the same amount, always the 15th of the month, always approved by Thomas Vance. I searched for Westfield Distribution Services online. The company had a basic website with stock photos and vague descriptions of logistic services, but no physical address, no client testimonials, no employee profiles. The contact email used generic hosting, not a business domain. The registration information for the company showed it was filed in Delaware 14 months ago. The listed business address was a mailbox rental facility. Everything about it screamed fake. I checked the bank routing numbers on the payment records. The money wasn't going to a business account at a major bank. It was going to a small regional credit union in Springfield, Illinois. My heart pounded as I pulled up one final document. The vendor registration form, filled out when Westfield was supposedly added to our system. It required a contact email for the business owner. The email address was T. Vance Consulting, at a free email provider. Thomas Vance's initials. I sat in my cubicle, staring at the evidence spread across my desk, and felt the world tilt. This wasn't a mistake or an oversight. This was deliberate, systematic. Someone had created a fake company and was stealing from FreightCor $42,000 at a time. I should have gone straight to the FBI. Looking back, that's obvious. But I was 29 years old, and I'd spent my entire adult life believing in proper channels and corporate procedures. You don't just call federal investigators when you find something suspicious. You report it to your supervisor, and they handle it appropriately. Thomas Vance was 3 levels above me in the corporate hierarchy. Going over his head felt dangerous. But taking evidence of fraud to the person committing the fraud felt insane. I decided to approach him directly but carefully. I would present it as a concern, not an accusation. Give him a chance to explain. Maybe there was some legitimate reason for these payments that I didn't understand. I requested a meeting, keeping my email vague. Need to discuss some vendor payment discrepancies. Do you have 15 minutes this week? He responded within an hour. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. That night, I made copies of everything. I saved files to a personal USB drive that I kept in my purse. I emailed documents to my personal account. I even took photos of some records with my phone. I wasn't sure why I was being so careful. Some instinct I didn't fully understand was telling me to protect myself, to create a backup plan. That instinct saved my life, professionally speaking, because the moment I walked into Thomas Vance's office, I realized I'd made a terrible mistake. Thomas's office was on the executive floor, all glass walls and expensive furniture. He gestured for me to sit, smiling warmly, like we were about to discuss something pleasant. I laid out the documents on his desk, explaining what I'd found as professionally as possible. The mystery vendor, the regular payments, the suspicious registration information. He listened carefully, nodding occasionally, his expression thoughtful. When I finished, he picked up the papers and studied them for a long moment. Then he smiled. Not a warm smile, not a concerned smile. A calculating smile, like someone doing mental math about risk and consequences. "This is good work, Vanessa," he said finally. "Very thorough, but you should have brought this to finance first, not directly to me. There are protocols for vendor inquiries." "I wanted to bring it to you because your name was on the approvals," I said carefully. His smile didn't waver. Chain of command exists for a reason. Next time, route unusual findings through the proper channels. I'll handle this from here. He stood up, still holding my documents. The meeting was over. I walked back to my desk feeling strange. Something about his reaction was wrong, but I couldn't identify exactly what. He'd thanked me. He'd said he would handle it, but those eyes when he smiled hadn't looked grateful. They'd looked cold. That afternoon, I locked my computer before going to lunch for the first time ever. The change was subtle at first, small things that could have been coincidence. An email thread I'd been copied on suddenly continued without me. A project meeting I'd attended every week for 6 months was rescheduled without notice, and when I asked about it, I was told they'd decided to move forward with a smaller team. My coworker James, who usually stopped by my desk every morning to chat about weekend plans, started taking a different route to his office. When I ran into him in the break room, his greeting was friendly but brief, and he left quickly. I told myself I was being paranoid, reading too much into normal workplace changes. Then I tried to access the vendor payment system and found half my permissions had been revoked. Files I'd been able to view for years were suddenly restricted. When I asked it about it, they said the access changes came from management. They couldn't tell me why. That's when the paranoia became certainty. Thomas Vance wasn't handling the problem. He was handling me. I started keeping a journal, writing down every strange interaction, every unusual change, every tiny shift in how people treated me. I documented timestamps, email subject lines, meeting cancellations. If someone was building a case against me, I wanted my own record of what was really happening. The isolation grew worse each day. 2 weeks after my meeting with Thomas, I couldn't take the uncertainty anymore. I needed to know if anything was being done about the fraudulent vendor or if my report had simply been buried. I drafted a careful email to the corporate compliance department. I didn't mention Thomas by name or make direct accusations. I simply stated that I'd identified possible irregularities in quarterly vendor disbursements and attached a summary of my findings. I read the email 5 times before sending it. My finger hovered over the button for a full minute. Then I hit send. The automatic reply came immediately. Your message has been received. A compliance officer will review your submission and respond within 5 business days. I closed my email and tried to focus on other work, but my hands were shaking. I'd just gone around Thomas Vance. I'd escalated beyond the chain of command he'd specifically told me to follow. 2 hours later, my desk phone rang. Vanessa, can you come to my office? Thomas's voice was calm, almost friendly. My stomach dropped. Now. Yes, please. Just a quick conversation. I walked to the executive floor feeling like I was walking to my own execution. Through the glass walls of his office, I could see him sitting at his desk, relaxed, looking at his computer screen. When I entered, he gestured for me to close the door. Then he stood up and closed the blinds. Do you know what happens when people go outside the chain of command? Thomas asked, his voice quiet and controlled. I tried to keep my voice steady. I sent a routine inquiry to compliance. That's what they're there for. That's not what they're there for, he corrected, still speaking softly. Compliance handles regulatory requirements and policy violations. They don't investigate senior management based on wild theories from junior analysts. I didn't mention you specifically, I said. He smiled that cold smile again. You attached documents with my signature on them. You knew exactly what you were doing. The room felt smaller suddenly. Thomas wasn't yelling or threatening, but his calm tone was somehow more frightening than anger would have been. Here's what's going to happen, he continued. You're going to send another email to compliance, clarifying that you misunderstood some vendor procedures and that your concern has been addressed. You're going to apologize for wasting their time. And then you're going to focus on your actual job responsibilities and stop playing detective. And if I don't, the words came out before I could stop them. His expression didn't change. Then we'll have a conversation about your performance issues, the ones I've been documenting over the past few weeks. Your difficulty accepting management direction, your increasingly defensive attitude, your inability to work effectively with your team. My blood went cold. Those are lies. Are they? I have emails. I have witness statements from your coworkers. I have documentation of your declining performance. He leaned back against his desk, arms crossed. Or we can forget this whole thing happened. Your choice. I stood there, trapped between truth and survival, and realized I was looking at a man who'd done this before, who knew exactly how to destroy someone while keeping his hands clean. I didn't send the email he wanted. I couldn't, but I also didn't know what to do next. That weekend, I barely slept. I kept replaying the conversation with Thomas, analyzing every word, every subtle threat. He had power I didn't have, connections I couldn't match, the ability to shape narratives and control information. Monday morning, I found a meeting invitation in my inbox. Performance review discussion, scheduled for that afternoon with Thomas and Patricia from HR. My annual review wasn't due for another 4 months. I walked into that meeting knowing exactly what was coming. Patricia had a folder in front of her, thick with documents. Thomas looked somber and professional, like a concerned manager dealing with a difficult situation. "Vanessa, we need to discuss some concerns about your recent performance." Patricia began, reading from prepared notes. For the next 30 minutes, they systematically dismantled my career. Every project I'd worked on recently was reframed as a failure. My attention to detail became obsessive micromanagement. My questions about procedures became evidence of my inability to follow direction. Thomas sat quietly, adding comments occasionally, his tone disappointed rather than angry, like a mentor saddened by a promising employee's decline. "We're putting you on a performance improvement plan," Patricia concluded. 60 days to demonstrate significant improvement in these areas." I signed the document because refusing would have accomplished nothing, but I knew the truth. A performance improvement plan wasn't about improvement. It was about building a legal case for termination. I tried going to HR directly, bypassing Thomas. I requested a meeting with Patricia's supervisor, explaining that I was being retaliated against for reporting potential fraud. The meeting was sympathetic but useless. "These are serious allegations," the HR director said, "but Thomas Vance is a vice president with an excellent reputation. The performance concerns he's documented appear legitimate, unless you have concrete evidence of retaliation." "I have evidence of fraud," I said. "Which is being reviewed by the appropriate departments," she replied smoothly. "But that's separate from your performance issues. I understand this is difficult, but I'd encourage you to focus on meeting the goals outlined in your improvement plan." Translation: "We believe him, not you. You're on your own." I left that meeting understanding something important about corporate justice. It doesn't exist. Power exists. Hierarchy exists. Loyalty to senior management exists. But justice, that's a fairy tale they tell you during orientation. 2 weeks later, I got the meeting invitation that ended everything. End of employment discussion. I knew before I walked into that conference room that I'd already been erased from the company. My badge was deactivated. My email access would be gone within the hour. They'd probably already cleaned out my desk and packed my personal items into a box. I was right about all of it. I walked out of Freight Corps carrying a cardboard box with my framed photos, a coffee mug my sister had given me, and a few desk supplies. My career of 7 years reduced to objects that fit in a single box. People avoided looking at me as I passed. A few coworkers I'd considered friends glanced away quickly. One person, James, mouthed "I'm sorry" when no one else was looking. But nobody spoke up. Nobody asked questions. They all just watched me leave, probably relieved it wasn't them carrying that box. I loaded everything into my car and sat in the parking lot for a long time, staring at the Freight Corps building. The rage I expected didn't come. Instead, I felt something colder and more focused. Clarity. Thomas Vance had won this round through power and manipulation, but he'd made one critical mistake. He assumed that forcing me out would end the problem. Hidden at the bottom of my box, tucked inside an old notebook, was the USB drive containing copies of every suspicious document, every fraudulent invoice, every piece of evidence showing 18 months of systematic theft. He'd silenced me at Freight Corps, but he couldn't silence the truth. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and started researching. How do you report corporate fraud? Who do you contact? What evidence do you need? The answers led me to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. The first 2 weeks after my termination were brutal. I filed for unemployment, knowing Freight Corps would probably contest it. I updated my resume and started applying for jobs, but each application felt hollow. How do you explain being forced out of your last position without sounding bitter or defensive? I couldn't sleep. I'd lie awake replaying every meeting with Thomas, every conversation, every moment I could have handled differently. Depression settled over me like a fog. But every time I considered just letting it go, just moving on and rebuilding my life, I'd remember that cold smile. The calculated way he'd destroyed my reputation. The ease with which he'd made everyone believe his lies. And I'd remember the stolen money. Over $500,000 now, probably more. Money taken from a company where regular employees worried about the cost of healthcare and whether they'd get annual raises. 3 weeks after my forced resignation, I opened the FBI's website and found the form for reporting financial crimes. It could be submitted anonymously, they said. No one would know who filed the report. I stared at the empty form fields for an hour, my cursor blinking in the space where I'd typed my story. If I did this, there was no going back. Federal investigators wouldn't ignore evidence like this, but they might not believe me either. I was a disgruntled former employee with an obvious grudge. Thomas was a respected executive with 15 years at the company. My finger hovered over the keyboard. Then I started typing. I wrote everything: the suspicious vendor, the pattern of payments, the fake company registration, Thomas's initials in the contact email, how I'd reported it internally and been forced out in retaliation. I uploaded every document from my USB drive. Bank records, vendor forms, approval signatures, email correspondence. Before I submitted it, I read through my report one final time. It was clear, factual, and damning. If anyone actually investigated, they'd find exactly what I'd found. If anyone investigated. That was the uncertainty that made my hand shake as I moved the mouse to the submit button. This might disappear into a bureaucratic void. It might be dismissed as the complaint of a bitter ex-employee. Federal investigators probably had thousands of fraud reports to review. But it was the only option I had left. I clicked submit. The screen confirmed my report had been received and would be reviewed. No timeline given, no promises made, just a case number and a generic thank you message. I closed my laptop and cried, not from sadness but from exhaustion. I'd done everything I could do. The rest was out of my hands. Then I tried to figure out how to survive while I waited. 3 months passed. I took a temporary position doing bookkeeping for a small manufacturing company, work that was far below my skills but paid enough to cover rent. I sent out dozens of job applications and got a handful of interviews, but nothing materialized. At night, I'd check the FBI website obsessively, searching for any mention of FreightCor or Thomas Vance. Nothing ever appeared. I started to believe my report had been ignored, filed away in some database, never to be reviewed. The fantasy of justice I'd been clinging to began to fade. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon in October, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. I almost didn't answer, assuming it was a spam call. Hello? Is this Vanessa Moore? A man's voice, professional and official. Yes, who's calling? Ms. Moore, my name is Special Agent Kyle Rhodes with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. I'm calling about a report you filed regarding FreightCor Logistics. Do you have a few minutes to talk? My heart stopped. The temporary office where I was working suddenly felt too bright, too loud. Yes, I managed. I can talk. We've completed our preliminary investigation into your allegations. Your evidence was extremely helpful. We'd like to meet with you in person to discuss next steps. Would you be available tomorrow? I sat down before my legs gave out. Tomorrow works. Excellent. I'll text you the address. And Ms. Moore, thank you for coming forward. Cases like this often go unreported because people are afraid. The FBI field office was exactly like I'd imagined from movies. Gray walls, security checkpoints, serious people moving purposefully through hallways. Agent Rhodes was younger than I expected, maybe early 40s, with the tired eyes of someone who saw corporate crime every day. He led me to a small conference room where another agent, a woman named Kim Chen, was already waiting. They had printouts of my documents spread across the table. "We've been investigating FreightCor for the past 6 weeks," Agent Rhodes began. "Your report gave us the roadmap we needed. We've confirmed the fraudulent vendor accounts, traced the money flow, and identified several other suspicious transactions you didn't have access to." "Other transactions?" I asked. Agent Chen nodded. "Thomas Vance was smarter than most. He didn't steal large amounts at once. But over 3 years, he's taken approximately $2 million from the company." $2 million? I'd only found evidence of $500,000. "We need your help," Agent Rhodes continued. "You're our key witness. You're the person who discovered the fraud and can testify to what you found and how you found it. More importantly, you can testify to the retaliation that followed." The words "key witness" hit me like cold water. This was real. They weren't just investigating. They were building a case. "What do you need from me?" I asked. "Everything. Every document you have, every conversation you remember, every detail about how this unfolded." I nodded slowly. "When do we start?" "Right now." Over the next 4 months, I lived a strange double life. During the day, I worked at the manufacturing company, doing routine bookkeeping. At night and on weekends, I met with federal agents, reviewed documents, and prepared testimony. They told me to act completely normal if anyone from FreightCor contacted me. Don't hint that investigators were involved. Don't make threats or accusations. Just be polite and professional. "We need time to build the complete case," Agent Rhodes explained. "If Vance suspects federal involvement, he'll start destroying evidence. We can't let that happen." So I stayed quiet, even when I saw FreightCor's press releases announcing record profits and company expansions. Even when I stumbled across Thomas Vance's LinkedIn profile, showing a promotion to executive vice president. That promotion felt like a knife in my chest. While I was struggling to pay rent and rebuild my reputation, he was climbing higher, stealing more, getting rewarded for the very crimes I'd tried to stop. But Agent Rhodes's words echoed in my head during those moments. "Don't worry, we're patient. We don't make noise until the trap is completely shut." I learned to be patient too. To trust that somewhere behind the scenes, people were working toward justice, even if I couldn't see it happening. The end came on a Thursday morning in March, almost exactly 1 year after I'd first discovered the fraudulent vendor. I was at my desk when my phone started buzzing with news alerts. The first headline made me drop my coffee mug. "Federal agents raid FreightCor Logistics headquarters in ongoing fraud investigation." My hands shook as I clicked the article. Photos showed FBI agents carrying boxes of documents out of the building I'd walked out of 7 months ago. Employees stood in clusters, looking confused and worried. The company had released a brief statement saying they were cooperating fully with authorities. But the detail that made me gasp was the final paragraph. "Sources confirm that Vice President Thomas Vance has been taken into federal custody for questioning regarding allegations of embezzlement and wire fraud." I stared at the photo accompanying the article. Thomas being led out in handcuffs, his head down, surrounded by agents. The man who destroyed my career was finally facing consequences. My phone rang. "Agent Rhodes." "I assume you've seen the news," he said. "I have." My voice sounded strange to my own ears. "We executed search warrants this morning. We have everything we need. The case goes to the prosecutor next week. We'll need you to come in for final deposition preparation." After he hung up, I sat at my desk, staring at nothing, feeling emotions I couldn't name. It wasn't triumph exactly, more like validation, proof that I hadn't been crazy or paranoid, proof that telling the truth had mattered. The news coverage continued for days. FreightCor's stock price dropped. Their CEO resigned. Employees started coming forward with their own stories of suspicious activities they'd noticed but been afraid to report. My phone wouldn't stop ringing. Former coworkers calling to apologize, to say they'd suspected something was wrong but hadn't known what to do. Reporters somehow getting my number, asking for interviews. Even recruiters, suddenly interested in the financial analyst who'd blown the whistle on major corporate fraud. I didn't answer most of the calls. I wasn't ready to talk publicly, wasn't ready to become the face of this story. But I did answer when James called. "Vanessa, I'm so sorry," he said immediately. "I knew something was wrong when you left. We all did. But we were scared. Thomas made it clear that questioning anything meant you'd be next." "I understand," I said, and I meant it. I'd been scared too. "For what it's worth, everyone here knows you were right. They know you tried to do the right thing and got destroyed for it, and they're ashamed we didn't back you up." It was the apology I needed to hear. 6 weeks later, I sat in a prosecutor's office, preparing to give my formal deposition. The assistant U.S. attorney handling the case was a sharp woman named Patricia Holloway who'd built her career prosecuting white-collar crime. "Walk me through it from the beginning," she said. "When did you first notice something unusual?" I told her everything: the $42,000 payments, the fake vendor, Thomas's cold calculation when I reported it, the systematic destruction of my career. Every detail I documented in my journal during those dark months. "Why did you keep pursuing this?" she asked at one point. "Most people would have just walked away, found another job, moved on." I thought about that question for a long moment. "Because I was raised to believe integrity matters," I said finally. "My parents taught me that doing the right thing isn't about whether it's easy or whether you'll be rewarded. It's about being able to look at yourself in the mirror. If I'd stayed silent, I wouldn't have been able to do that." She nodded, making notes. "That's going to resonate with a jury." "Is this definitely going to trial?" I asked. "Almost certainly. Vance's attorneys are trying to negotiate a plea deal, but the evidence is overwhelming. If they can't work something out, we'll go to court in about 6 months. 6 more months of waiting. 6 more months of having this hang over my life. But at least now, I was waiting with hope instead of despair. The trial began on a cold morning in November. I'd been warned it might last 2 weeks, possibly longer. The courtroom was smaller than I'd imagined from TV shows, but filled with people. Prosecutors, defense attorneys, reporters, Freight Corps employees. And Thomas Vance, sitting at the defense table in an expensive suit, looking nothing like the man I'd seen in handcuffs in those news photos. He never looked at me during the trial, not once. Even when I was on the stand, testifying about discovering the fraud and reporting it, his eyes stayed fixed on the table in front of him. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They traced every fraudulent payment, showed the fake company formations, presented testimony from banking experts about the money trail. They brought in other Freight Corps employees who testified about Thomas's intimidation tactics and the culture of fear he'd created. And they showed my evidence. The documents I'd saved on that USB drive, the journal I'd kept documenting the retaliation, the emails proving I'd tried to report the fraud through proper channels. The defense tried to paint me as a disgruntled employee seeking revenge. They questioned my motives, suggested I'd misunderstood legitimate business transactions. But the numbers didn't lie, and there were too many numbers to dismiss. After 12 days of testimony, the jury deliberated for 7 hours. The verdict came back, guilty on all counts. Thomas Vance was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison and ordered to pay full restitution to Freight Corps. His attorneys immediately filed appeals, but legal experts said the conviction would likely stand. I sat in the courtroom during sentencing, listening to the judge describe the betrayal of trust, the calculated nature of the crimes, the need for accountability. When it was over, Thomas finally looked at me, just once as the marshals led him away. His eyes were empty, his expression hollow. I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no revenge, no anger, just a quiet sense that something broken had been repaired. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded me asking for comments. I kept my statement brief. "I'm grateful the system worked. I hope this sends a message that fraud will be investigated and prosecuted, even when committed by powerful people. And I hope it encourages others who witness wrongdoing to come forward, despite the risks." That night, Agent Rhodes called to congratulate me. "You did something remarkable," he said. Most people in your position would have stayed silent, would have protected themselves instead of doing what was right. You should be proud. I just wanted the truth to matter, I replied. It does, and that's because people like you refuse to let it be buried. 2 weeks after the trial ended, I got an unexpected call from Freight Corps' new CEO, a woman named Angela Torres who'd been brought in to clean up the company's reputation and rebuild trust. Ms. Moore, I'd like to offer you a position as Director of Ethics and Compliance, she said. We're completely restructuring our oversight processes, and we need someone who's proven they'll speak up even when it's difficult. I almost laughed. You want to hire me back after what happened? I want to hire you because of what happened. You're exactly the kind of person we should have protected and promoted. Instead, we let you be driven out. That was a failure of leadership, and I'm trying to fix it. The offer was generous. More money than I'd made before, significant authority, a direct reporting line to her. I thought about it for exactly 5 seconds before answering. Thank you, but no. Freight Corps needed an ethics director a year ago. What the company needed was courage from the people already there. I appreciate the offer, but I'm not interested in going back. There was a pause. Then she said quietly, I understand. For what it's worth, I'm sorry for what was done to you. I hung up feeling lighter than I had in months. That chapter was closed. I was ready to start a new one. 3 months later, I accepted a position with a nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting whistleblowers and supporting people who report corporate fraud. The work was meaningful in ways my old corporate job never had been. Every case file I reviewed felt familiar. Different names, different companies, but the same patterns, the same retaliation, the same fear, the same courage required to speak up. I started speaking at conferences about whistleblower rights and protections. I consulted with legislators drafting stronger anti-retaliation laws. I helped other people navigate the terrifying process of reporting fraud and surviving the aftermath. One afternoon, I received a letter from a young analyst at a tech company in California. She discovered evidence of accounting fraud and was terrified to report it. I read about your case, she wrote. You lost everything by telling the truth, but you also proved it was worth it. I'm going to report what I found because you showed me that someone has to. Thank you for being brave enough to go first. I read that letter 3 times, tears streaming down my face. This was why I'd fought, not just for justice in my own case, but to make it easier for the next person and the person after that. The system only works when people refuse to stay silent. 1 year after Thomas Vance's conviction, I was having coffee at my favorite cafe when a notification popped up on my phone. A news article. Key witness in major fraud case inspires National Whistleblower Protection Initiative. The article described how my case had become a catalyst for stronger whistleblower protections in several states, how it had led to policy changes at major corporations, how it had inspired other people to come forward with evidence of fraud. I wasn't named in the headline, but there was my photo halfway through the article, taken at a recent conference where I'd spoken. The barista called my name for my order. As I stood up to get my coffee, a woman at the next table stopped me. Excuse me, are you Vanessa Moore? I nodded, suddenly nervous. I just wanted to thank you, she said. I'm a financial analyst. I found some irregularities at my company last month, and I reported them because of your story. It was terrifying, but they actually investigated. They found fraud. And because I documented everything carefully like you did, I was protected. You probably saved my career. I didn't know what to say. Finally, I managed. Thank you for being brave. As I walked out into the bright morning, I thought about the younger version of myself who'd sat in a conference room, hand shaking as she signed her forced resignation, who'd felt powerless and alone and defeated. I wished I could tell her that it would work out, that speaking up would matter, that the system, imperfect as it was, could still sometimes bend toward justice. I'd never wanted revenge. I just wanted the truth to be louder than the lies. And somehow, against all odds, it had been.